Thank you, Mr. Powell. You go by Jimmy, is that correct?
Yes,
Is that correct?
correct.
Okay. Can you state your full name for the record?
James Ernest Powell II,
And by whom are you employed?
Summit Carbon Solutions,
In what capacity?
as Chief Operating Officer.
Okay. And can you briefly describe your role with respect to the project that's before the commission today?
I'm accountable for the engineering design, the execution or construction, and ultimately operation of the Midwest Carbon Express project.
And can you provide us with a brief summary or overview of the project?
Sure. So the project captures carbon dioxide from the fermentation process at what is now 33 ethanol plants located in 5 states, those being Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota. We compress that gas, CO2, into a supercritical state. We inject it into a pipeline network that's comprised of approximately 2,058 miles of 4-inch through 24-inch pipe. And in these 3 counties, it's 24-inch. We transport that to sequestration site Mercer and Oliver counties for injection and permanent storage and sequestration.
And what counties will the pipelines cross in North Dakota?
10 counties in total.
Okay. And do you have the names of those counties?
Not off of the top of my head, I don't.
And how many miles of pipeline will be located in the state of North Dakota?
Approximately 320. And that excludes the mileage in the sequestration area.
And in terms of ethanol plants in North Dakota that will be putting CO2 into your pipeline, are there any?
Yes.
Okay. And what is the name of that ethanol plant and where is it located?
It's the Tharaldson plant, and that's located on the eastern side of the state.
In terms of new information, at the previous hearings, you provided some testimony with respect to easement acquisition. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you recall the last time you testified what you provided in terms of testimony as to easement acquisition?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that was?
At that time, it was approximately 70%.
Okay.
That's been acquired across the state.
And as you sit here today, what is your understanding as to what the number of easements or the percentage of easements that you've acquired as of today?
Today, it's approaching 72%.
Okay. And also, Jimmy, at the last hearing, there were some questions. I believe it was. I'm not sure if it was by the interveners or if it was by the commission staff, but there was some question about the 500-foot setback to the pipeline. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
Okay, and I believe your response was that you measure the 500 feet from the corridor boundary. Is that a correct statement of what you testified to at the previous hearing?
I believe it is.
Okay. And can you describe for us what the actual approach is in terms of measuring the 500-foot setback to the pipeline?
Yeah, the actual approach is from the center line of the pipe, as it's located in that corridor, to the nearest corner of the structure or dwelling.
Okay. And so all the information that has been provided to the commission in terms of setback to the pipeline was, in fact, from the center of the pipe to the nearest point of the structure. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it was just a minor error that you made indicating that it was a setback from the corridor.
That's kind, Mr. Bender. I misspoke. Correct.
That's all the questions I have.
All right. Mr. Pelham, any questions?
Mr. Powell, I know at a prior hearing there had been an inquiry as to, by Commissioner Chrisman, as to a potential crossing elsewhere in and around the city of Bismarck. Is there any update on that?
There is, Mr. Pelham. So we're developing an analysis of a southern crossing on the south side of Bismarck versus the current route on the north side of Bismarck. And the first draft of that analysis, or the final draft of that analysis, should be ready mid-May.
And as far as the State Historical Preservation Office, is there any update as to where the process is for its concurrence or non-concurrence of the proposed route?
Yeah, so the SHPO has provided questions back to our team,
and we're currently in process of responding to the SHPO. And some of that, Mr. Pelham, some of that response will include some clarification around survey, especially cultural survey that was previously performed. So that should be available in the very near term.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Mr. Bakke, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor. First of all, Mr. Powell, you mentioned there are 33 ethanol plants. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Has there been one added since you testified in Bismarck?
There has.
Okay, and where has that been added?
South Dakota.
And where in South Dakota?
That's in Turner County, South Dakota.
So in North Dakota, there will just be one ethanol plant that will benefit from this Summit pipeline.
I wouldn't agree with that statement.
Okay. So what other ethanol plant will be contributing CO2 from North Dakota into the Summit pipeline?
Well, there's at least one other plant that we're actively discussing potentially injecting CO2 into our system that's located in North Dakota.
Okay. But I'm asking about in terms of your application to the PSC now.
As we sit here today, there is one, correct.
Okay. On this easement acquisition issue, let's focus specifically on Emmons County. You have the exhibits in front of you. I'd ask you to look at exhibit W107.
I have it.
Okay. Have you seen this Emmons County ordinance that passed in January of 2023 in Emmons County?
I have.
Okay, and you're aware you're testifying here in Emmons County today?
I am.
Okay. And you see that was unanimously approved by the Emmons County Commission 5-0 on February 7, 2023?
Yes.
Okay. And one of the things that this ordinance deals with is setbacks. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the setback that Emmons County is requiring for the Summit pipeline, should it be built in Emmons County, is there can be no pipeline right away within 2 miles of the corporate boundaries of any city, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. Would you agree that's a prudent thing for Emmons County to do?
I would not.
Okay. You don't think there needs to be some separation from where the population is and this CO2 pipeline?
Well, as I think you're aware, Mr. Bakke, PHMSA, the federal entity that governs or provides oversight of design, construction, and operation of liquid pipelines, they govern not citing of that, but setbacks. They have a reference. So that's one benchmark that we use. The other is the analysis around dispersion, which we've talked about in previous hearings. And we use the guidance provided by PHMSA and our analysis to determine what risk there is to municipalities, landowners, etc. And we use that as a guide for the setbacks.
Okay, and
In North Dakota, as you know, there's a state law of 500 feet.
And PHMSA, the PHMSA regulations by the federal government, you're aware those are in the process of being amended, correct?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, so you're not aware that they've issued an order indicating that they're going to be looking at the changes to the rules and regulations to address safety of citizens in areas that may be populated as a result of the leak of CO2 in Satarsha, Mississippi?
Well, I think you're mischaracterizing that, Mr. Bakke. They've already issued a finding
a report. And in that report, Satarsha, they found that there were 5 contributors to that release, and each of those contributors would be covered by the current regulation. As you probably know, PHMSA updates their regulation about every 4 years, and I don't think it's specific. So this is the normal course of business. So I don't think it's been characterized as safety as a result of the Satarsha incident.
And so you dispute that the PHMSA has indicated that they're going to be addressing changes to the rules and regulations in regards to the safety of CO2 pipelines directly in response to the leak and incident in Satarsha, Mississippi, where 45 of the 50 residents of Satarsha as a result of that leak were sent to the hospital. You dispute that?
Madam Examiner, I'm going to object. Mr. Bakke had, I think, the better part of 3 hours to cross-examine Mr. Powell in Bismarck. He has no clients in Emmons County, Logan County, or McIntosh County that I'm aware of. My understanding is that the reason he's here is so that we can cut back on the workload that we're going to be having in Bismarck. And if we're going to go through a bunch of cross-examination, we're going to have the same problem in Bismarck that we had in Bismarck before. We're just not going to have time to cover all this stuff.
I agree. We address the PHMSA rules in Bismarck, so if we can spend time on other issues, that would be appreciated because we've got an abundance of testimony to get through today.
Sure, and I'm just following up on his answer because I believe it directly contradicts the PHMSA order, which indicates that it is as a result of the leak in Sarsarea that they are going to be amending the rules and regulations out of concern to safety issues and the public health issues as a result of that leak. And I think there's already an exhibit that's been submitted to the commissioners. So let's turn back to the Emmons County ordinance. In terms of the 2 miles within the corporate boundaries of an organized city, you don't think that's a necessary safety determination by Emmons County to protect their citizens in the event there was a leak of the pipeline and the associated public health issues that would arise in the event of a leak?
Same objection.
Again, I don't know how long we're going to spend on this, but I think Mr. Bender has a valid point that Mr. Bakke, your witnesses or your client is in Burleigh County, so I'm not really sure that this line of questioning is relevant to your position in this case as far as your client is concerned.
Well, the reason it's relevant, Your Honor, is it deals with the safety of the public in populated areas where there are citizens. I think the people of Emmons County and Burleigh County and every county in North Dakota are entitled to know what Summit's position is as to whether public health and safety risks are important to Summit. I hear this witness saying it isn't.
And you're
Well, and to that point, I think he's answered. Okay, I'd ask the public to please refrain from commenting and clapping. I mean, we just have so much to get through today. I think he's answered that question regarding his position on the ordinance. So I don't know if I interrupted you, Mr. Bender.
Okay. There are other parts I want to briefly cover with him on the ordinance because there's other setbacks.
Well, if you can do it briefly.
Sure. Yeah, and another setback is that the Emmons County ordinance indicates that the pipeline should not be any closer than 1.5 miles of an established residence. Do you agree that's an appropriate safety measure to avoid the risk of public health issues in the event of a leak for the citizens of Emmons County?
I do.
You agree that is appropriate?
No, I don't. I disagree that it's appropriate.
Okay. Do you agree that it's appropriate not to have the CO2 pipeline in Emmons County within 500 feet of any building or surface water body?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's North Dakota state law that the pipeline has to be located a minimum of 500 feet from a dwelling, a habitable dwelling, or we have to obtain a waiver.
Okay, so you disagree with that as well?
Yes.
Okay, let me ask you about the investors in Summit. Were you aware that my client through me asked for a list of investors in the Summit pipeline?
I am.
Okay. And did, in fact, Summit provide a list of investors?
Mr. Bach, you will know that the commissioner, one of the commissioners also requested that list, and that was filed with the commission.
I understand that. That's what I'm going to ask him about. And to speed this up, if you could look.
To you, and we didn't respond to you. We responded to the commissioner.
Right, and that was my point. I think he agreed you didn't respond to me. Can you turn to Exhibit 164?
Mr. Baki, I don't have a 164. I have a 158 as my last exhibit.
We have the exhibits for everyone. I apologize. It's in.
Is this a new exhibit, Mr. Baki?
It is. Yeah. Yeah, and we have some new exhibits, Exhibit 159 through 178, which are in a separate binder up there. Oh, in the same binder, I'm sorry.
Do you have a copy?
Yeah. Yeah. Just yeah.
Do you have one for all the commissioners?
Give the whole bag.
So I can pass these down.
Okay, go ahead.
It's the whole set. It's the whole set.
We've done this already. This is not the time to do this. Try it out. Do it before the hearing.
There's extra copies here. Mr. Leibel, do you need a copy?
Oh, and I apologize, Stephen. I didn't mean to just take that copy.
Have you had a chance, Mr. Powell, to look at Exhibit 164?
Just the second page. No, I have not had a chance to look beyond that.
Why don't you look at the first page? It says, it's got Summit Carbon Solutions letterhead, and it says Summit Carbon Solutions LLC investor list, correct?
It does.
And there's a second page identifying 5 investors in the Summit pipeline?
That's correct.
Okay. And then just their website information, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And do you agree that the Public Service Commission should be provided with detailed information regarding the investors in Summit?
I would agree that we should provide what the commissioners asked for. Yes.
Okay. Did the commissioners just ask for the name of 5 of the investors, or did they ask for the names of all the investors?
Well, in my experience, Mr. Baki, the commissioners are very, very capable of expanding the request. So when we submit a document in response, or we submit a response to the commissioners, if they feel that it's not adequate, they follow up and tell us what they believe is adequate, and then it's our duty to comply.
Okay. Do you think the members of the public, the citizens of North Dakota, are entitled to know who the investors are in the Summit pipeline?
Well, I think what's important to the citizens of North Dakota is that they understand that the pipeline that we will construct, if we're granted a permit by the PSC in North Dakota, will strictly adhere and or exceed the requirements of the federal regulators.
Okay. Well, isn't one of the issues that the Public Service Commission is being asked to analyze here is whether or not this Summit pipeline is for the benefit of the welfare of the citizens of North Dakota?
I believe they stated that earlier, yes.
Okay. And so part of that would be whether or not any of these companies that are investing in the Summit pipeline are citizens of the North Dakota, correct?
I don't make that connection.
Well, are any of these 5 investors that are listed on Exhibit W164, Continental Resources, TPG Rise Climate, Summit Agricultural Group, SK Group, Tiger Infrastructure Partners, Citizens of North Dakota?
Well, Mr. Bakke, some of these investors are funds, and so I don't know, but I'm assuming they have many investors in those funds. I don't know who those individuals are or where they live.
Okay. Well, let's take, for instance, on the investor list, this SK Group. Isn't SK Group a South Korean company?
Yeah, they're a global company. They are headquartered in Seoul, South Korea. They have a large presence in the United States, correct?
Sure. An SK Group recently had a top executive indicted for alleged breach of trust and embezzlement of $190 million. Is that correct?
Here,
Mr. Bakke.
I mean, how long are we going to go? Are we going to go through every member of Continental Resources and determine, what their background is? I mean, the whole idea behind Mr. Bakke coming down to Linton was so that he could put on some of his witnesses so we could take the pressure off of Bismarck. What it's being utilized for is another 2 or 3 hour cross-examination of Mr. Powell.
I have that concern as well, Mr. Bakke. We have 12 witnesses outside of public testimony to get through today, and you have the right to cross-examine witnesses, but again, we have a very ambitious schedule today, so we need to balance that.
I'll try to be as fast as I can, but I think this is a new issue they raised. They provided the investor list that the commissioners requested at the hearing in Bismarck. We now have it. I think I should be allowed to ask who the investors are and whether any of them are from North Dakota and whether there's any benefit to the citizens of North Dakota.
Well, he's already answered whether or not any are from North Dakota, and his answer was he wasn't sure, and that most of these are investment groups. So,
right, and that's why I followed up and asked him questions about.
Okay, well, I don't want to spend time arguing with you, but I think he has answered that question.
Okay, so let's turn to TPG Rise, one of the investors in the Summit pipeline. Is TPG Rise Climate owned in part by the China Silk Road Fund?
Mr. Bakke, I'm not an expert in who the investors are in TPG Rise Fund.
Okay, so you can't tell me whether there's a Chinese company that's invested a significant amount of money in the Summit pipeline?
No, I cannot.
And I notice on the investor list, Summit doesn't indicate the amounts that are invested. Has Tiger Infrastructure Group invested $100 million?
That sounds reasonably accurate.
Okay. Has the Canada-Ontario Teachers Pension Plan invested $300 million in Summit?
Not that I'm aware of.
Has Continental Resources invested $250 million?
They have, and I'm glad you mentioned Continental Resources because obviously they're a huge contributor to oil and gas development in this state, especially on the western side of this state.
And then this Tiger Infrastructure Group is Mr. Bruce Rastetter of Summit, a senior advisor for Tiger Infrastructure?
Not that I'm aware of.
Has this SK Group from South Korea invested $110 million?
That sounds reasonably accurate.
Okay. Are there a total of 464 investors in the Summit pipeline? Does that sound accurate?
As I mentioned, Mr. Bakke, some of the investors are via funds, and those funds have multiple investors. I'm not aware of who all those individuals are.
And I'm not asking who all the individuals are.
You asked me a number, Mr. Bakke, and I'm not sure what that number is.
I'm asking about companies that have invested in the Summit pipeline. Are there hundreds of them?
Companies?
Right, entities.
No, I
Hunter,
don't
again,
think there are
I'm going
hundreds
to
of
object.
companies.
This is a total waste of time. He's getting another opportunity to cross-examine this witness. If he wants to burn up his time asking these sorts of questions in Bismarck, fine. But we're down here to try to take some pressure off of Bismarck, and Mr. Bakke certainly isn't doing that with this line of questioning.
Your Honor, these are questions I would ask in Bismarck.
Ask him in Bismarck.
But that's the whole purpose of us being down here, is to save some time in Bismarck. So I'm asking them now rather than in Bismarck, because we have an ambitious schedule at both places. That's the whole reason Mr. Leibel and I are here today, or at least Mr. Leibel in part, is to call some of these Burleigh County witnesses and ask some of the questions relating to Burleigh County, which apply.
Can you tell me approximately how many more questions you have, or length of your questions for Mr. Powell?
Probably 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, let's get through it.
Okay. I mean, there's many more investors in the Summit pipeline than the 5 that Summit has identified for the Public Service Commissioners. Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, Gary Therrelson is an investor in Summit. He's in North Dakota.
Anyone else you can name from North Dakota who's invested in the Summit pipeline?
Mr. Bakke, you've asked me several questions about this, and you yourself asked me if there are hundreds of investors, and I believe that's a fair assumption. And no, I don't know each of those individuals by name.
Okay. But Summit would have that information, wouldn't they?
Mr. Bakke, I'm not the commercial officer of the company, so I don't spend my time reviewing that information. I'm concerned about the design and construction and ultimately operation of this pipeline. That consumes my time.
Sure. And I understand what you do, but my question is, are you telling the commissioners and the public that Summit doesn't know who the investors are in Summit, that someone at Summit doesn't have that information?
Mr. Bakke, as I mentioned earlier, what I'm telling you is the commissioners are very capable of telling us what information that they expect or they want. And if we don't provide that at the level of detail that they want, they're very capable of telling us that wasn't good enough. And so if they ask for more detail, then we'll consider providing that.
Is the public in North Dakota entitled to know who the investors in Summit are to gauge whether this project is for the benefit of the state of North Dakota and the welfare of the citizens in North Dakota? Or is that to be kept secret?
There are privacy issues with who invests in any company, Mr. Bakke.
So is it Summit's testimony that the public and the commissioners don't get to know who the investors in Summit are?
I didn't say that.
Okay. And Summit isn't claiming this is some sort of national security risk if Summit discloses who the investors are in Summit, such as the China Silk Road Fund, are they?
I don't remember anyone claiming that could be a national security risk, Mr. Bakke.
Okay. And so Summit concedes the 5 names of the investors that they gave to the Public Service Commission is woefully incomplete, because you agree there's hundreds of investors.
I think your mischaracterization around woefully incomplete is for the commissioners to provide their feedback to Summit as to whether they think it's adequate or not. To my knowledge, I haven't heard that it was woefully incomplete.
Well, just here today, the handout provided by the young lady here on behalf of Summit, and she's here on behalf of Summit, correct?
Are you speaking to Miss Sabrina?
I don't know the young lady's name. At the table there with the handouts.
Sabrina Zanor.
Okay. And on that, it lists another investor, John Deere, but that's not on the investor list that Summit gave to Public Service Commission, is it?
Mr. Bakke, I'll say it again. If the commissioners want more detail about who the investors are in Summit, I'm sure they'll ask, and then Summit will have to consider whether or not to provide that information.
There's a frost heaves study, Exhibit 162, that's been provided since the last Bismarck hearing. And that's performed by a Gulf Interstate Engineering out of Houston, Texas, a Mr. David Ammerman and a Mr. Lance Thomas. And the date of that report is April 17, 2023.
Correct.
Have that available to you?
I do.
Okay. Has Gulf Interstate Engineering ever done any engineering work before in North Dakota, to your knowledge?
Yeah, I'm sure you know, Mr. Bakke. Gulf Interstate is probably the premier pipeline engineering design company in the world. They do work all over the world, and they have done work in Canada, in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, the upper region of the United States.
Okay, so what engineering work, what frost heave study has Mr. Ammerman done from Gulf Interstate Engineering before he did this one for Summit in April of 2023?
Mr. Bakke, I don't have Mr. Ammerman's CV in front of me, but as I stated, he represents Gulf Interstate. Gulf Interstate is the premier pipeline engineering company in the United States and one of the premier engineering companies in the world.
Okay. And I'm asking specifically about the gentleman who performed the frost heave study for Summit. Can you tell me one frost heave study he's ever done before in North Dakota?
If you know.
What I can tell you is that we have an internal staff of very talented professional engineers, and they've reviewed the work that Mr. Ammerman and others have done and stand behind this study.
Okay. So who are the engineers, the talented engineers that reviewed his work?
Mr. Alex Lang, Mr. Eric Skubinik.
Okay. And have they done frost heave studies in North Dakota?
They've done frost heave studies. Eric Skubinik has, yes, on the western side.
Okay. And this frost...
They're very rare, Mr. Bakke, because frost heave, there's not a permafrost risk in North Dakota, and in fact in the lower 48 of the U.S. And so buoyancy is a risk. Frost heave is not.
Okay. So frost heave, at least as far as Summit is concerned, is not an issue or concern for pipelines buried or installed in North Dakota. That's your testimony?
It's not Summit's opinion, it's a fact.
And did Summit just do the one frost heave study for the proposed Summit pipeline?
Yes.
Okay. Where was this frost heave study? Which county, which location?
It's across the full length of the pipeline in North Dakota.
So Summit did multiple frost heave studies, and we just have the one?
This is a summary.
Okay. Well, this doesn't identify any specific location along the 2,000-mile plus pipeline where this frost heave study was performed by Summit, does it?
Well, I think what it does indicate is what is heave and what factors have to be present in the substrate in the soil and moisture content for heaving to be a risk, and that those aren't present in North Dakota.
Well, in terms of frost heave, will frost heave conditions vary from where this pipeline starts in Ames, Iowa to where it ends in southern North Dakota, or is it uniform frost heave in that entire 2,000-mile plus area?
Well, I'm sure you've read this. It depends on the consistency of the soil, the amount of moisture that's present, etc. But frost heave is not a risk in the lower 48.
Okay. But Summit is telling the PSC and the public that as far as Summit's concerned, in terms of frost heave concerns, one size fits all. You just need to do one frost heave study for 2,000 plus miles and call it good. Is that your testimony?
No, it's not my testimony.
But you can't tell me that they did more than one frost heave study, correct?
Mr. Bakke, what I can tell you is Summit and Summit's consultants have done all the analysis that's required by all regulators, including PHMSA, and that we feel are adequate to safely design and construct this pipeline.
Well, doesn't Mr. Ammerman say in this report on page 5 of section 7 under section 4.3, frost penetration, several factors influence seasonal frost penetration depth, and then he lists a number of factors: vegetation cover, snow cover, number of degrees day below freezing, soil grain size, moisture content. Doesn't he say those are all factors?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, there's going to be a significant difference between the number of degrees days below freezing in Ames, Iowa versus Linton, North Dakota, isn't there?
There could be.
Okay. And the information that he used for soil temperatures actually came from Mandan, North Dakota, correct?
Yes, we typically try to look at the worst case scenario.
Okay. And this Mandan, USDA Mandan station isn't even in the path of the Summit pipeline where he got his soil temperature information. Is that correct?
Again, Mr. Bakke, we look at across the state and across the length of the pipeline. We look at the different soil structures, soil types, weather conditions, range of weather conditions, and those were used to determine that we do not feel there's a frost heave risk.
Okay. And Mr. Emmons says on section 5.2 is the soil temperature necessary to create frost to a depth greater than 51 inches is not probable, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And is that for the entire length of this 2,000 mile plus pipeline?
Mr. Bakke, as I've said a couple of times now, there are many different factors involved that would have to be contributing to for frost heave to occur. And we do not feel that they are present at any point along the pipeline in North Dakota or the other 4 states.
Except for
And
no
I think
studies.
I think if you can cite an instance where there was an incident or an issue with frost heave in North Dakota, I'd be happy to look at it.
Well, have you done any frost heave studies in North Dakota yourself?
On the western side of North Dakota.
And in terms of...
I haven't, let me correct for the record, Mr. Bakke. I haven't done frost heave studies myself, but we've had them done.
And do you understand that if there's frost heave below a pipeline, that what can happen is there can be a rupture or leak in the pipeline?
Well, I think you're speculating, Mr. Bakke. If there are conditions present that could result in heaving, and that heaving was extreme enough to move the pipeline and put stress on it, potentially. But I think that's a big stretch. And as I've said a couple of times already, there is no incidences that I'm aware of heaving in North Dakota or the upper part of the United States. And in fact, in the whole lower 48.
I mean, isn't it common knowledge in North Dakota that in farmers' fields, pastures, that you can have rocks, large rocks sometimes make their way to the surface due to frost heave?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. I mean, if there was a rock below the Summit pipeline and frost heave occurred, it could push that rock into the pipeline, causing a leak, couldn't it?
Well, I am aware that there are tens of thousands of miles of pipeline in North Dakota. There's Dakota Access. It's a pipeline that's traversing, this part of the state. And I'm not aware of any incidences of frost heave, and that pipeline's been in service since 2017.
And the Dakota Access pipeline, to be clear, that's an oil pipeline, not a CO2 pipeline, correct?
It is.
Okay. You would concede the CO2 pipeline industry is a very young, untested industry because in the whole of the U.S., there's only about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines.
Now, that's a gross mischaracterization, Mr. Bakke. There's been CO2 pipelines in service in this company for over 4 decades.
You're saying
there's one in North Dakota. It's been in service for 20 years.
So your testimony is there isn't just approximately 5,000 miles.
There is, but that you can't conflate the length of pipeline with being a new industry. And it doesn't matter, in my opinion, whether it's CO2 in the pipe, crude oil in the pipe, natural gas in the pipe, or refined products. Still governed by PHMSA the design, construction of those pipelines. And a weld is a weld, Mr. Bakke.
So in Summit's opinion, a CO2 pipeline is no more dangerous than a natural gas pipeline.
I'd say less so.
And a CO2 pipeline has no purpose for individuals for their homes, such as a natural gas pipeline, where we all, especially in North Dakota, need natural gas to heat our homes in the winter, heat our other buildings, correct? CO2 you'll never connect to your home and use.
Connect to your home, no, but there are industrial and commercial uses for CO2.
But not in populated areas or not in cities or near residents.
Oh, there's wastewater treatments in populated areas, and that's one industrial use, yes.
One of the other things that's discussed in relation to Mr. Ammerman's frost heave study is groundwater issues need to be taken in consideration. Can you point to me in the report any groundwater considerations that were taken into account by Mr. Ammerman in determining his frost heave study conclusions anywhere in North Dakota?
Well, you know that the extent of the permit application in North Dakota is significant. And so there are a lot of analysis that's been done on not only water tables and other type of either areas that we have to avoid or areas we have to consider along the pipeline route, and they are not all reflected in this report.
In regards to this frost heave report by Summit, did Summit consider any information in regards to soil moisture and temperature below 40 inches?
We considered the data that's available as to those factors, yes.
Okay, so you don't know?
No, I said yes, we did.
Okay. And specifically where?
Again, Mr. Bakke, I'll repeat myself. There is not a frost heave risk in North Dakota for this pipeline.
Where are the 5 monitoring stations described by Mr. Ammerman located in his report? There's no identification provided, is there?
I'd have to go back and reference the detail.
Well, would you agree 5 monitoring sites over 2,000 plus miles is inadequate to have any reliable information in regards to frost heave or to come to any conclusions?
I would not.
Okay. Can you identify any city anywhere in the U.S. where a CO2 pipeline has run through a city, a populated area?
Well, again, Mr. Bakke, I'm not familiar with the location. Generally, I am of the other CO2 pipelines in the country. Generally, pipelines try not to traverse through cities, although you know yourself in Bismarck, you have a refined products pipeline and a natural gas pipeline that run through the city. So I'm not aware of the other pipelines in the country, exactly their location. But most of them are in West Texas, Wyoming, the Dakota gasification project. It goes north in Dakota, North Dakota. Most of them are not in areas where they would likely, but I don't know that for a fact.
Okay. My question, however, is specific to CO2 pipelines.
My answer was specific to CO2.
Okay. So you can't name a single location where there's a CO2 pipeline in the U.S. that runs through a populated area. True?
No, it's not true, Mr. Buck. Yeah, I'm not sure where those pipelines, what areas they traverse, and whether they do or do not traverse the city.
Can you name a single city or location where a CO2 pipeline runs close to a populated area?
Again, I'm not intimately familiar with the routes of those pipelines.
Your Honor, I thought we were going to stick with new issues. I don't know. This isn't.
And I just
I think we're about out of time.
One final question here. And that question is, all these locations of these CO2 pipelines that you discussed here today, Wyoming, Dakota Gasification Company, Texas oil fields, those are all in very rural locations, correct?
Again, I'm not sure of the exact routing of all those pipeline systems, but you know yourself, you mentioned it's Satartia, by the way. You mentioned Satartia, Mississippi, and that pipeline runs from Louisiana to Mississippi, and it is not all rural areas.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Leibel, any questions?
Yes, Your Honor, and I'll be very brief, limited to one clarification about
Sure.
the direct.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So, Mr. Powell, you're going to hear a little bit later from an Emmons County resident who's going to ask the commission to delay their decision-making until PHMSA updates their safety regulations. And my understanding from your testimony earlier is that that update is actually something that happens in the regular course. Am I summarizing your testimony accurately?
I think that's the case, yes.
Okay. And so it's your understanding that that's unrelated to the Satartia, Mississippi incident.
Well, again, as I mentioned to Mr. Bakke, the PHMSA report from the incident, it references 5 what I would consider failures, and all 5 of those failures are currently are addressed in the current regulation.
Okay. So if PHMSA had decided to reevaluate all their regulations in light of Satartia, don't you think it would be reasonable to wait to see what PHMSA identified needed to be changed?
Well, again, PHMSA's already reviewed the Satartia incident. In their report, they referenced the 5 failures, and those 5 failures are covered in their current regulation. So if the operator of that pipeline would have addressed those 5 areas, that may have impacted the incident.
Could you please turn to the document that's been admitted as Exhibit W147?
It's that same.
I think it's in the skinnier. It's one of the Warford exhibits. It's 147. And I jump over there.
147. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I have it.
Okay, now document 147 appears to be a news bulletin from an official website of the United States government. Do you see that at the upper left-hand corner?
I see it's an official website of the United States government, correct?
And at the very bottom, it has the website on there, and it's https://www.phmsa.dot.gov. Do you see that at the bottom left-hand corner?
I do.
And this news bulletin is dated Thursday, May 26th of 2022. Do you see that?
I do.
And I'm going to read just the first sentence here of this bulletin, and it says the U.S. Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, parentheses PHMSA, today announced it is taking steps to implement new measures to strengthen its safety oversight of carbon dioxide pipelines around the country and protect communities from dangerous pipeline failures. Do you see where I read that?
I do.
Could you please read that next sentence for me?
The new measures, as well as an enforcement action taken today, are a result of PHMSA's investigation into a CO2 pipeline failure in Satartia, Mississippi in 2020.
And the rest of that sentence says that resulted in local evacuations and caused almost 50 people to seek medical attention, right?
Correct.
And the next paragraph talks about that PHMSA is undertaking to strengthen CO2 pipeline safety, and they list 5 bullets there, including additional research, a failure investigation report, an updated nationwide advisory bulletin, and new rulemaking to update standards for CO2 pipelines, right?
Correct.
And so when you testified earlier in response to Mr. Bakke's question that there was no reason to wait. The rulemaking was just a standard course, something that happens every 4 years. That was not accurate.
No, that was an accurate statement. What I'm saying, if you read down through these bullets, it's talking about emergency preparedness and response. That's a robust standard requirement anyway. And the valve spacing rule that came out in 22, I think, was in part due to the Satarsh incident. So if PHMSA were grossly concerned about safety related to CO2, I think they would act very, very quickly.
Well, according to this, they are acting, right?
Well, again, I'm saying that CO2 is referenced in 195, PHMSA Regulation 195, CFR 49195. And there are also components, depends on if it's a supercritical dense phase, like we are going to transport our CO2, or it's a gas phase, which would be in 192. So I think PHMSA intent, and I'm not speaking for PHMSA, but my understanding, their intent is to clarify the standards and the requirements in both of those standards to make sure they're clear.
And it's someone's position that we don't need to wait for PHMSA to clarify those regulations.
Yes.
That's all I have.
Mr. Pranis, any questions? Commissioner Crispin?
Since our hearing in Wapaton, were you able to identify the occupancy of the building just south of the Theraldson plant that looks to be within the North Dakota state law 500-foot setback range?
Yes, sir.
And what is that?
I'll have to refer to my map, but it is, that building was not, if I remember correctly, Mr. Chrisman, that building was a shed or barn. You're not referring to the one that looked like the long strip?
I can look up the page number, but it looked like a long, very long building, yes. Like something probably commercial or industrial.
I think the answer is yes, and I can get you the document that depicts that.
Yeah, I do want that ultimately.
Okay. You know, what we've done, Commissioner Chrisman, has taken, I know you can't see this from there, we've taken all those instances and we've actually put the location along the pipeline and then the track number and the distance from the pipeline to the corner of the dwelling, etc. We've done that in all those instances.
Okay, and so I will want that specifically. If we've gotten it, maybe I just need a reference to where it is, but I didn't notice it if it's been turned in. And did you ever get a number on the depth of the bore underneath the Red River?
We submitted a document showing all of the major water crossings. If I remember correctly, there may have been 11 HDDs. Where those were located, and the depth of the pipe below the mud line in each one of those.
Okay, if we have that, I will review that. And then my last question, you had said, I think, that you're approaching 72% easement acquisition. That's across the whole length.
Yes, sir.
Within North Dakota or of the whole pipeline?
The whole pipeline, we're about 68%. So North Dakota's a little ahead of the curve.
And in the past, you've turned in a document that showed it in like per foot or per mile, per occupant, both ways, because it can vary quite a bit, although your numbers have been fairly close in each of those. But do you have a new one now? Oh, and also county by county. Do you have a new one that you're turning in today, or will there be?
We have one coming. It will be turned in today. They signed about 7 tracks late last night.
Oh.
And so they wanted to make sure those were incorporated. So that will be provided today. Yes, sir.
Okay, very good. No other questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert?
Thank you. Thank you for hanging in there. And it was brought up about the safety valves. Mr. Leibel, I think, just briefly mentioned it. And you talked in Bismarck a lot about the safety features on the pipeline and the valves. Can you tell us, just to recap or confirm, that those safety valves are located, 20 feet apart?
No, ma'am. The new PHMSA rule that was issued in 22 says the maximum spacing for valves, for block valves, is 20 miles.
20 miles.
Previously, that's fine. Previously, there was restrictions around major water crossings, either side of a pump station or facility, but there was no intermediate, to my knowledge, there was no intermediate spacing requirement. And without going into too much detail again, typically when we're developing a project like this, we do an analysis around risk. Where's potential risk? Where could we have a release? And how to mitigate that risk and the volume of material that would escape. And that's how you locate the spacing of your valves. But PHMSA was much more prescriptive in this new rule and said 20 miles is the max spacing, and with high consequence areas, it's even tighter. And before that rule was official, the project adopted that. And that added about 70 valves to the project. But Summit adopted that requirement before it was officially a rule.
So just to summarize, Summit is putting valve spacing with that additional less than 20 miles apart?
In some cases, there'll be less than, for instance, in North Dakota at the Missouri River crossing, there'll be a valve on either side of the river. Okay. So that'll be much closer than 20 miles. But at any point along the pipeline length, valves cannot be spaced. Mainline valves cannot be spaced more than 20 miles apart.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I have no further questions.
Mr. Dawson?
Judge Hogan, Mr. Powell, I have a question because of a question she asked, and that is there any other way to mitigate risk besides valves?
Yes, there are many ways. One, through a robust integrity management program that PHMSA requires, and that's having a cathodic protection system. And that's where we're going to install an impressed current system, which essentially just puts a sacrificial anode so that any soil constituents that may erode the pipe will erode the anode versus the pipe. The PHMSA requirement is to have that in place 1 year after operation. We'll have that in place on day one. We're running inline inspection tools. It's coating, it's the thickness of the material, and it's leak detection. And so we've talked about this, and I know we did in Bismarck. We'll have a real-time transient model, which just means we'll have a simulated operation of the pipeline running in parallel to the actual pipeline. So an operator is sitting at his console and he's looking at both. And if they don't align, and especially if it's the operating pipeline, then he can take action. So sorry for the kind of a meandering response, but there are many factors that could mitigate that risk.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Bender, any redirect?
No redirect.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Powell.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question?
How many do you have?
Just a couple.
And Your Honor, I'm going to object if it goes outside the scope of, I would say, my redirect, which he should not be allowed to ask any questions, but if it goes outside the scope of what the commissioners have asked.
And it's in regards to one of Commissioner Chrisman's questions.
Okay. It needs to be quick because we need to move on.
So you were asked about the easement percentage, and you had mentioned in your testimony that we are analyzing a southern crossing of the Missouri River, correct?
Well, we're at the request of the commissioners, we're analyzing a route south of Bismarck.
So my question is, in relation to the 72% of the easement, which counties would this affect? The southern crossing?
I'd rather not get into that here. When we submit the analysis, it'll be very clear what's impacted.
Okay. And when does Summit intend to submit the analysis to the PSC on the southern crossing?
Asked and answered.
If you can just repeat.
Yeah, I said the final draft will be done middle of this month.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Powell.